Thank you very much for your very warm introduction and those figures that you mentioned that show my age. Thank you to Michael Taylor and to Javier Sánchez Cañizares. Congratulations, because you won this award some years ago. Michael, more recently. And thank you to the Universidad Francisco Vitoria and to the Institute for organizing this roundtable, which is the amazement of the world through quantum physics and ecology. And I want to say some things regarding this topic, which I imagine is going to give us food for thought and for our discussion. And we're going to talk about the macro and the macro and micro, something that has to do with the matter itself, but then we're going to go to something beyond, which is the ecology, the ecological systems and planets, what both things are linked, the micro and the macro. And with what I would like to begin, which is probably the reason why we are here talking about quantum physics and ecology, I would like to start speaking about what we understand by amazement. Michael? Well, thank you very much, first and foremost, to the Foundation for having invited me to come here. It is a great honor and a gift, I have to say. Amazement, wonder. It's a key word for any child, and it is an important issue for philosophy too. Plato said that philosophy starts with wonder, with amazement, with A. And I started like a child, always looking for things in the forest, and I was always amazed, and that is why I started to study ecology at university, and I ended up doing salmon research in Alaska. But it also made me question myself more and more, and awe or amazement is something very simple, but you can also reflect on it more deeply from philosophy, and it is important to know what it is. There have been different definitions. Plato said it was the beginning of philosophy, but then we have Descartes, who said that A is fine, wonder is fine, to the extent it makes you question, but then you have to get rid of it, because it means that you already have the information, you already have the content. But I think this is a modern distortion of it has to come. And I like this reflection of an American philosopher who says, in philosophical terms, proves how humble we have to be vis-à-vis the human being, because awe is the amazement of the person vis-à-vis the enormous amount of things that reality has, that we are surpassed by a reality. So awe is a reaction vis-à-vis this. It is not that there is a mystery and we do not have enough information. Sometimes we think this is the case, but it can be the opposite, too much information. So this speaks of how the human reason is. The human reason does not encompass all the universe. It is a problem if we think this is the case. This is the modern pride, I believe. So it gives us this humbleness to be awed, to be carried by awe, and this is a world which is communicating beauty, because, for instance, we are surprised by something as beautiful as dusk. And I like looking to these moments to receive this gift, which is the experience of awe that reminds me of me being limited, of me being a human being, but it is a piece of this truth, a piece of this. Thank you. Javier, I wanted to ask you your more scientific facet, this relationship between awe and science, or awe thanks to science. I'm not surprised or wondered by anything. How many times we have said such a thing. I'm never wondered or surprised about anything. And, well, first and foremost, we have to be thankful for being here, because this is already wonderful enough. But when we were speaking about this, and when I was listening to Michael, I was thinking, how does a scientist see, because I'm obviously going to defend more the scientific vision because of my background, how does a scientist understand awe, as you were asking me, awe from the scientific vision? Well, there is a relative awe, or is there an absolute awe or wonder? Because there are many things that we wonder about when we were a child, and we no longer wonder about when we grow up and when we have a larger experience. So what are we wondered about, and what aren't we wondered about? What does the scientific feel wonder about? And I believe one of the things that may wonder the scientists is that we live in a world which is not chaotic, and you will probably think, how come? Well, this is rather wondering, because what does it mean to live in a world which is not chaotic? Well, we could be living in a world whereby in 3 seconds this would explode, this stage would explode, where light would become bullets that kill us, and then we would rise again. Why is the world not like that? Well, we live in a world where there are certain patterns, where there are systems of particles, like we scientists like to talk about. There are stable patterns that last for a certain time. There are particles that have an average life which is infinite. For instance, proton. We don't know if it's an infinite life, the one that proton has. We are amazed that we find correlations and that we can make science because we find a link. That is what really wonders the scientist. It is not just that we have found something which is in excess and then shows my limits and makes me feel part of the mystery, because as Michael said, we are part of this nature, we are part of these orderly patterns, and we can understand a lot about this. And I don't want to elaborate too much, but I would like to refer to one of the most important scientists in the world. If you were asked here, who is one of the most important scientists in the history, I would say Isaac Newton, but most people would say Einstein, who was expressing his wonder vis-a-vis nature, but not only about nature, but he was always surprised about how men could understand how nature worked, the process of nature, and I would like to refer to these words that Michael said. The intelligibility of nature, and something that I want to refer to. He said, the science we make, the order that we try to describe with our equations and our scientist training is not something that we put on nature, and he put as example the order of the dictionary. We have invented how to put order among words, the alphabet, so the words in any language can be ordered according to the alphabet. But we all know that having a dictionary of a language does not mean that you can speak the language. You may have a German dictionary, and you may not speak German, even if you can look a word up in that dictionary to find what is the meaning in your own language, because to speak it means many more things. So what Albert Einstein said is that the order that we find and that we describe with the science of nature is not something that you find in a dictionary. It is something real, which is in nature, and what was more amazing for him, the miracle, is that order in nature and that subjective order, because we humans are the ones who can know about nature, had a big overlap. So he called this a great miracle, which is another way of understanding the amazement or the wonder vis-a-vis the miracle, and the miracle of that intelligibility, that great link between nature and our capacity to know it. Can I add something else? I fully agree with what you have just said. And talking about amazement, I would make a distinction between the natural wonder or amazement vis-a-vis things that can be very simple. What is this, or how marvelous this is? The fact that I can understand it, the wonder of a child when facing something beautiful. But this takes us to a more deep question, which is known as a metaphysical question by excellence, which is, why is there something and why isn't there anything? And science does not want to answer this question because it takes for granted that there are things, that they're here. And the fact that the things exist is, well, a matter of intelligibility that takes us to think of what you just mentioned, that we are part of this world. Sometimes we take a perspective from the real world of creation. This can help us lead our conversation. Well, before we discuss it more deeply, and before we go to see how that order is expressed from the quantic level and the elemental particles to the large ecosystems, and why we have that order, and why and how the quantic world has an impact in our awareness and intelligence, I would like the two speakers to tell us what is their contribution. In the case of Michael Taylor, his book, The Foundation of Nature, is very interesting, especially in a field that I don't know much of, which is ecology. But I would like you to elaborate a little bit more about the metaphysics of the gift. like promoting bioethical behaviors that will promote ecology, but also towards a human being. So what is the metaphysics of gift? And how can you respect the human being and the human life through it? For those of you who know St. Thomas metaphysics, metaphysics of gift is nothing different. But I like to refer to this because there are many metaphysics. Metaphysics is a word that frightens us sometimes, but it shouldn't. It has to do with the way we understand the physical and non-physical world and how we live in this world and what is the interaction. So we all have a conception of reality. I wouldn't get up from my bed if I thought that the floor was going to disappear the moment I stepped on it, but I know it is going to stay there. So the metaphysics of gift has to do with what you discover regarding reality. It was very simple, and the Greeks already realized this, namely that everything which is created, as we Christians would say, is not in existence by itself. So if we don't exist by ourselves, our existence has to be given by someone else. So to us it has been given as a gift. And this is a pattern of the cosmos. And it is even deeper, because if we're talking about existence, for instance, if I say swimming, swimming does not exist in itself unless you swim. For instance, a swimmer, a fish, it only exists in the concrete, and the existence, the being, does not exist by itself in this world. It only exists to the extent it donates him or herself to a being. And this is what it means to be created, to be a creature. And in these regards, being, the existence has to be given. And this is a pattern that we can see everywhere, in chemistry, in ecology, in the way all the animals and minerals in an ecosystem have to relate to each other, and you can find it in human relations. For instance, if you ask me who I am, then I tell you where I come from, how many siblings I have, my last name. So all these elements are linked. I don't identify myself as an isolated human being. So to call it metaphysics of gift makes us see reality with these eyes of gratitude, humbleness, and of looking for these relations that make us more being. Can you do metaphysics without knowing physics? That's a tricky question. Hardly. I believe that one of the problems that we have in our days, that we have been inheriting for a long time, comes from an accident, a historical accident, that I believe has taken place. And maybe I'm going to be a little bit controversial or provocative. This is that Aristotle made a mistake with physics, and he actually did a very good work with metaphysics. So it seems it is possible to do physics without, or metaphysics without knowing physics. But as a friend of mine says, from a lie, anything can come up, even the truth. So I believe that great part of the modern problem we have had is that science and philosophy have grown apart, not because of the method of statement of the 16th century from Descartes, etc., but because the philosopher has thought that he could make philosophy just focusing on metaphysics, and the scientist has decided to focus on this interpretation of nature, which is now made by science, and the philosopher no longer needs to do so. I believe there is a deficit of nature philosophy, and this is a problem that we do not overcome. I believe we still have to do a nature philosophy from the vision of nature that contemporary science is presenting.
So to give you an answer, no, I don't think so. I think it can be done, but something else is missing from that metaphysics. Without knowing physics or without knowing the new perspectives, the new visions, the new conceptions of the way nature works, the relational nature that Michael has explained very well, about how it is building nature. Nature is being self-built with its own law, how that may benefit a more finished type of metaphysical building or construction, not nature. I don't know if that's an answer valid enough for you. Related also to your research work, Michael, you're talking about two current ways of approaching ecology. On the one hand, the more technocratic paradigm, it is a view scientific or of nature, and in front of that, eco-philosophies, a series of attitudes, maybe beliefs, which is more related to the relationship and intimate values. And you are proposing a third way, an alternative as an ecological ethic with a wider paradigm to settle the vision more in depth about the relationship. Can you please tell us a bit more about that? Oh, yes. The world we live in, the vision, the dominant vision of the natural world is marked by a mechanicist mindset. That is to say, a reductionist analogy. Let's assume that we may refer ourselves and understand nature as if it were a machine. This is easy to do if you think about the movement of stars, cosmos, and the fact that there's a regularity, everything is determined, it can be calculated. And this is an analogy that can help us understand some elements of nature, but nature is not something that we have done ourselves. It is not something mechanical. There's more things that happen in nature. So this new modern way of understanding nature is marked first by the materialism, and also it is marked by the mindset that we may exchange one thing by the other one. That is to say, reducing things to numbers, basically. There, you're losing the dignity of each individual. Humans and non-humans, they are replaceable, or it's even worse. It is seen as a flow of energy. And in front of the world, of the modern world, and the Industrial Revolution started to treat animals as things. There's a lot of people that nowadays object to that. Those are the so-called animalists who see or believe that it shouldn't be the way. We shouldn't treat animals that way. I agree with them, actually, in that sense. But they have another vision, another position that leads you to the other extreme, which is that all of this is wrong, and actually the way of understanding nature is not a machine with parts that can be separated or put together, rather as a big energy flow, right? And that involves an anthropology that immerses us in the nature, saying that we are one more member of the nature. We're not privileged, we're not different, therefore we don't have any right to hurt anything, nor to turn things into idle. And therefore vegan styles, maybe because of health, but also because of ideological reasons. So metaphysics, none of them talk about metaphysics, maybe the second one a little bit, but my philosophical, metaphysical analysis of the positions of what is reality shows that the first one has that modern mechanicist view, while the second one has this holism. And you can see that with quotes or sentences, statements such as, we are all stardust. And actually this vision loses also the value of the individual, because if we're all stardust, we're not individuals, we're not ourselves. The key is taking the best from both worlds, because we're substances, we're individuals, we're not separate from the rest. And as I said earlier, I define myself because of my relationships with others. I cannot live alone. Men are not islands. What I try to do and propose in my book is nothing original. It is just a matter of approaching from a philosophical point of view the education, the teachings of the creation. We depend on a gift, which is the existence. We are individuals with dignity, typical of our nature, our essence. And the rest of the nature also has dignity. It doesn't have to be an opposition. That is to say, we need to defend the dignity of the nature in order to defend the dignity of mankind also. Because there's a difference, no doubt. But it calls my attention that in the mechanicist vision of the technological paradigm, where all of the problems, including human problems, are solved either with technology or with politics, right? And money in between, obviously. Any problem goes to those two things. On the other hand, it's the same, because they're also materialistic, even if it's a different type of materialism. But none of the two are capable of valuing, for instance, a non-born baby. So on the one hand, it is relativized, and on the other hand, it would be a damage to the environment, to bring an environmental sin, to bring another world to another life to the world. We need another vision, which corresponds to a very old vision that the Catholic Church has always taught about valuing the relationships with others as much as individuals with their own dignity, in a hierarchy, sort of. Not leaving anyone outside of it. Actually acknowledging that one is dependent on the other one. In many ways, actually, mysterious ways that we do not know about. They're talking about saving the forests in Brazil because there may be medicines there that cure us. Yes, maybe. But that is only one superficial example of the need we have of this ontologic community that we creatures are. I'm going to provoke. Allow me, so that it's not just you. You, Michael, talked about two terms that we've already mentioned, which are reductionism and scientism, as problems to face in order to face the study of the advancements of nature's sciences. But reductionism is a derivation of reduction, and scientism is a reduction or a derivation of science, and reduction is an important part of scientific method. What's the barrier? Where is the barrier? Where is reductionism becoming something pejorative, leaving the reduction of the scientific method, or when is it becoming something negative, leaving behind the application of science? Javier, do you want to start? Let's see what I can answer. Yes, it's clear that we need to differentiate the reductionist program or reductionism from scientific reduction. I would like to ask myself a question. Who does not reduce? When we get a lot of information, we say, summarize it, please. What is the important part, right? When we do science, at least in antiquity, the definition of science of antiquity is knowledge certain by causes. We look for causes that give somehow a reason, a summary of what is happening. That's what science wants. Science is knowledge, and it is looking to find something common to those patterns that we find in nature, the common principles. Another thing is thinking that that is all of the entire reality, or that is all of the entire knowledge. Reduction is always an isthma, a reductionism when there's a hypertrophy, and when you go beyond what you're doing. Allow me to please defend the scientific reduction. It is very important. Imagine that we had to be inventing and reinventing new things for every natural process. For this projection that we have on this slide, or for the fact that we're not falling down to the center of the earth because the floor or the ground is sustaining us. We know quite well the basic principles of how nature works, even if there's other things that we're missing. I believe, therefore, that maybe we have been suffering the hypertrophy of science, because science has forgotten about its pre-assumptions, ontological but also epistemic. Science may forget about its ontologic pre-assumptions, along the lines of what Michael said, when, for instance, it's forgetting that things are, that the universe exists, that systems exist. That's given. That's given as a pre-assumption, ontological one, in order to be able to do science. Even the fact that things have an essence, the fact that they have a way of being, that's given. Obviously, I can reduce from the universal fundamental laws that there's going to be these beautiful blue chairs or this nice green chair that I'm sitting on. That is no evident at all. There's many steps needed and many assumptions needed, so that science may study how the projection on the screen works, but also epistemological principles. Science does not build itself. It needs to connect with other knowledge, with other experts. I love Bernard Heisenberg, I need to say, because when he was asked about quantum mechanics, he said that quantum mechanics is the way it is because we know the world the way we know it. That is to say, there's a natural, spontaneous knowledge of the world and of things that we try to explain, and it so happens that we can only do that with a theory such as that of quantum mechanics, or part of it at least. But what Heisenberg said was that the natural knowledge that we have of things, that's a presumption, an assumption of science. When we talk about the fact that observations are necessary in order to test scientific theories, what we're saying is that at the end we need to connect with what seems most immediate to us, which is our onboard, the entire world, but mediated by our senses. So that's a beautiful task, I believe, of science. That means that from our cognitive bias, anthropological bias, because we shouldn't forget that we have senses that make sense of the world, that work with a certain level of energies and physical magnitudes, and in spite of that initial bias, our sensitive knowledge, we're capable of going beyond advance towards a knowledge which is as objective as possible of nature, of reality. We should never, though, throw away the first step that we started which is our usual knowledge, our sensitive knowledge, the observation of the world as persons, the way we see it. Science may commit the sin of starting everything as Adam from scratch. You can't. It's impossible. You can't start everything as Adam did from scratch. That's one of the sins of mechanicism. I don't know if that was another question. Yes, scientificism, the pretension of finally we found a universal methodology, the single and universal knowledge. It is a very necessary knowledge, and it needs to be supplemented with other ways of accessing reality. There's something here that you said, and I'm not sure I understood correctly. Do you believe that there is a causality relationship from micro to macro and the other way around, the way the world makes principles and the principles also make the world? Quantum mechanics, does it have anything to do with that? Wow, I could spend several days discussing that. It could be the subject matter of an entire conference. I think that there's a causality relationship, up, down, and down, bottom up, from micro to micro, and the other way around. And that actually fits with the metaphysic vision that Michael talked about, which is the metaphysics of gift. When he was talking about being and how beings give the being once to others, the eolatic principle came to my mind, which is that being is causing, or being capable of causing. If you don't have causal power, you don't exist. And in the universe where we are, one of the biggest reasons is the causal relationship amongst different things, obviously with different levels of causality, different types, different intensities, but there's a real influence of beings amongst themselves. There's sort of like a giving yourself as a gift to other beings. Well, that with quantum mechanics, we would go even beyond that. But what I mean is that I believe that science, contemporary science, is discovering that I cannot build the universe. I cannot find a description which is cognitive complete of the universe just by starting from the bottom, from the level of fundamental particles. We don't even know which ones they are. We do not even know which ones they are, because the standard model we have nowadays is a model that needs to be completed because there's some problems. So we don't even know if there is a fundamental level of particles. We don't even know which are the fundamental interactions. We know that there's 4 which are very important, but we don't know whether they come from a more fundamental interaction, how that happened, how that was more specified, how that has emerged in the history of cosmos. But as one starts studying other levels of reality, one needs to introduce new information, or one starts to introduce new causal principles that give reason to the fact that there is such a well-ordered structure of atoms, such as the one we have right here in front of us, or obviously with human beings. What causes the emergence of a complex system, as complex as any of us? It's just an illusion to believe that that can be explained with initial conditions and with laws that direct the universe forever. I believe that in nature there is a causality that is appearing at each level, and that allows for that development of nature, that determination of nature in different levels. So to answer your question, yes, I think that we need to take into consideration all of that causality levels, because there's all those levels of being. There's that deep analogy in the different levels of existence in nature. Michael, I interrupted you earlier, I'm sorry. Yes, I totally agree with you, Father. And it's very important, I believe, to clarify that the scientific method has a very useful and necessary thing. It's a very useful and necessary thing for us, but some of the things that are reduced or extracted do not say the truth. The truth is reduced to precision. It becomes something subjective, beauty also. In the modern world, therefore, beauty, being good, is subjective totally, and the truth may be numeric but not much. It's important, I believe, when we remember that this is not the reality. This is a useful method, but after using that method, you need to get out, because one of the principles of metaphysics, and this the gift of being, is that the being involves certain characteristics which are the truth, goodness, and nature that marks everything, and that leads us to very deep conclusions. And even the smallest things, as a mosquito, you have to say that it's good to a certain extent. It's interesting, I believe. If you think about education and how we educate or how we generate our vision of reality, Plato said that we have to educate with gym and music and poetry help you. But if you're exposed from an early age to music, you listen to harmonies or you listen to something beautiful and something good, and when you're faced to that, you have to take a decision. You have to take an option. Either it is good and you accept it and you consider it a treasure, a good treasure, or you reject it, but you cannot be too neutral in front of that. So being exposed to music for a child and beautiful things, as the children books nowadays have values, well, we need to expose them so that the child can say, yes, this is goodness, this is good, this is what I want. And modern mentality or mindset that is just developed or based on a scientific vision, which is agnostic vis-a-vis goodness of the created world. That is to say, it's good for me only if it is useful for me at a certain point in time. If it is not useful, it is not good for me. In that sense, it's truly subjective. That does involve a way of viewing the world and a rejection or a blindness vis-a-vis the goodness of reality. So I believe that's one of the dangers of making the method absolutizing the method, or forgetting that we're using a method without giving up the method. You need to have both. Do you want to continue, or do you want to add something? Actually, we continue, because I'm not so clear about what I want to add. Okay, then I'm going to make a statement. Our world needs quantum processes. Our brain does also. Do you agree or not? And related to that, a couple of reflections that I'd like you to say. I didn't understand you. Our world needs quantum processes. Our brain does also. There's two things derived to that. Number one, consciousness and nature and delusion. And the second one is the problem of freedom or free choice. Well, my goodness, thank goodness I didn't add to the previous statement. Well, what we're saying is trivial, because we all need quantum processes. At a basic level, nature works through quantum processes. They're the basis of everything that happens. Now, if you ask me up to what extent quantum mechanics is necessary in order to understand, but we need to explain what we mean by understand the scientific problem. To what extent we need the description of quantum mechanics in order to understand the way the brain works, or, I don't know, the way the shirt we're wearing works. And some of these things are under discussion, because there's not an answer that is shared by all. So, you've been talking about quantum mechanics. We were talking about the issue of objectivity and subjectivity. Therefore, I would like to make use of this opportunity, and I'll talk about freedom of will later, but I'd like to make use of this opportunity to try to explain why it is that the quantum mechanics has an appeal. We find it interesting. Sometimes when we don't understand the problem, we tend to say, well, it is because this has to do with quantum processes. Otherwise, go and watch Marvel's films or the TV series, and there's more and more reference to quantum physics and multiverse. What's therefore the importance of quantum mechanics for deep thinking on reality, philosophy, metaphysics? Well, the importance in my mind is that quantum mechanics shows us that the subjective and the objective in nature and in our knowledge of nature are connected in an unexplainable way, which is difficult to explain. That does not mean that quantum mechanics is subjective and therefore anything may happen. Not really. We live in a world which is in orderly, at a macro level, at least a macroscopic level. We may trust that there's permanence of things and things are, to a certain extent, stable. But what quantum mechanics say is that the mechanicist vision that we were talking about is not true. The fact that the world is totally determined and our knowledge of the world is just as a mirror. I look at the mirror and without affecting at all what is happening, I would be understanding it. There would be a perfect reflection between nature and my knowledge of nature. It doesn't work like that. It's not as simple as that. It so happens that not only because the presence of the observer disturbs the processes that are happening there, but also we, with our knowledge, ask questions to nature, and we ask nature to be determined in a certain sense or another sense, but we're not capturing all of the wealth, the fullness of potential, fullness of nature. Quantum mechanics, in that sense, says that the presence of a subject and observer is necessary in order to be able to obtain information. That does not mean that the information is subjective. Thank goodness those that do quantum mechanics are quite in agreement when they write down the equations and the wave function and Redinger equation and the probabilities that the spin is upwards or downwards. There's an objectivity quite shared in that description, but in order to reach that objective description, it is necessary to have the presence of the subject that develops the experimental context in order to obtain the results. And those two things are clearly united. If there's no observation, be it an experiment that the nature asks in order to determine it in that sense, in one sense or another, there's no result. You don't have the result before you ask the question, before you do the experiment and put that experimental context. You don't even know what you have to ask, because depending on the question you ask, you may obtain different results. Okay, then. I believe that this opens the possibility to realize that, well, maybe the nature requires a treatment, it requires an access to it that goes beyond the myth of pure objectivity or myth of mechanism or determinism, where everything is knowing the state of nature at a certain point in time and laws of nature, everything is determined. Well, I believe that cannot be, it can be sustained. That would be called nowadays super determinism, but that is a metaphysical, not scientific position, and metaphysically it's bad. Quantum physics, I believe, allow us to have a nature with processes that lead nature to be determined at certain levels, where everything is interconnected amongst themselves, and curiously enough, there's a construction which is more and more objective. What is the relationship of all of this with brain, the emergence of the mind, with the free of will? Well, it has the relationship that obviously if we lived in a totally deterministic world, freedom is a rara avis or a contradiction. Freedom would be an illusion. Quantum world, without giving us an answer to what freedom is, It doesn't mean that a human being is free. That's very complex to answer. You need contribution of science, neuroscience, philosophy, and we shouldn't forget theology also. Because I'm just going to give you as an anecdote. A few months ago, I attended a congress of neuroscientists and philosophers, and in the dinner of the congress, one of the neuroscientists that was not a believer, talking to another philosopher who was not a believer either. So a scientist and a philosopher, both of them are non-believers. At the end of the dinner, at a certain point in time, both of them told me, interestingly, you agree in the fact that free of will is an issue that can only have a serious response from theology, and I was surprised.
Well, going back to what I was saying, quantum physics gives the possibility or gives room for, in nature, in the natural world, where the man is also part of, freedom can exist, self-determination, the capacity to decide what I'm going to do with my life and what do I want to do, if I want to pick up this glass of water or not, just because I decided to do it, to give you an example. So, determinist definition of nature did not allow. It is not the panacea, but it opens room for a proto-freedom or freedom to exist. And so freedom and random go together. That's it. I wouldn't say that non-determinism is random. Random is a word that I want to leave aside because it can cause much misunderstanding. I believe that you can speak about chance or when I have to distribute the different variables in a random way, but to say that there is chance in nature, I believe it is forbidden for us. We cannot speak in those terms. If quantum mechanics is the closest way in which we can define nature, I don't know. But even quantum mechanics do not speak about pure chance, but only in very specific situations. I prefer to speak about determination or indetermination and to understand freedom as capacity, one of the most or the deepest ways we have of determining. But nowadays we don't have a full vision of how you can go from the determined well to the non-determined way. I fully agree. I fully agree. Is there anything that you would like to respond in such a way? Because I think he was very complete in what he said. I fully agree. I think that human freedom has to be understood, and in all those dimensions. And this secondary causality, or call it as you like, can be seen analogically throughout creation in nature. So we can determine things. 100%. If you allow me, when we have heard about mechanicism, why this mechanicistic philosophy appeared. There is a reason for it. Simplifying it a lot, they preferred metaphor to understand nature until the Middle Age is that of organism. But that made us think that there were different principles in the vegetables, or the trees, the philosophical stone, a world where there were magic things. So mechanicism is something that helps a lot to know things, even if not perfectly, but to know them well. So the advance of Newton's mechanics are something that has no precedent in science, and the problem is to think that mechanicism is going to solve everything. But mechanicism speak about machines, everything. So machines are very good. When we have a machine, sometimes it is easier to understand a machine than a human being. But in nature, to build a machine means to build a device and to take it away from the natural flow, because that is why you want a machine to exist for a purpose, and that's it. That could lead us to artificial intelligence. But nature has not a single goal. What is the aim of nature? There seems to be a direction, there seems to be an end, but little by little we understand things. So what I want to say is that it had a reason for being, but it is a big mistake to think that it is the best way to understand things. The reasoning for nature is not a mere mechanism. Everything is related to everything. Well, like what we find in organisms, where we see that the human being is like an absolute element, because the soul is part of him and we are interested in everything. So to try to understand the human being in a mechanicism way is a big mistake. I would like you to comment on what is the final end of nature. What is the reason, the end reason? And if we can find an answer to this.
Yo creo que hay estos dos modos de históricamente de entender.
We have these two historical ways of understanding nature. We are more in the mechanistic element right now, but we cannot go to the other extreme, to the organic vision. This would be Gaia's theory, which is a holism that forgets about the human being. And what the philosophy allows us, and analogy allows us, is to take from both and to understand that nature is something in itself. And we are both individuals and the definition of the person. The person belongs to a community and it cannot be separated from it. And you cannot lose one or the other. That is why Joseph Ratzinger, before becoming Pope, he said that substance and relationship are equally fundamental, to the extent that before we're something, we are relations. We cannot do anything, we don't become anything until we have a relationship. We are a physical relationship with genetics, with our parents. So what is the end purpose of nature? St. Thomas has a principle which is that the effect is linked to the cause. And in reality, this leads to theology. Doesn't have to be this way, but we see how in the world we see a growth of beauty and this tendency to survival, the existence of life to survive. to stop for a moment thermodynamics or entropy talks about something special in nature, but I would even dare to say, and I believe that revelation helps us a lot because we can see also the lack of it in nature. We can see death and the negative in nature, and we can see also a trend to try to reach an eternal stability, and we see also tensions in nature. So this helps me to understand my faith and revelation. But I believe we can see these dimensions and we cannot ignore what the appearance of life means, something that we still cannot explain scientifically, and what it entails. Nature is a complex system made by more or less simple elements. Obviously, an ecosystem is much more. Can we speak about emerging systems or emerging properties as a combination of all these? And those systems can be defined based on the elements and the laws that rule those interactions, and that emerging model can be one of the theories of the appearance of the mind, or like Voltaire. There is an underlying mechanism that has been criticized. So to what extent the addition of simple mechanisms and laws can give rise to many more complicated mechanisms? Well, clearly, life appears like something radically different to the mineral world. I believe there are similar things. The chemical relationships between things show a give and take, something that life shows even more strongly. But there is a danger. Science and eco-philosophies like using emergence to try to explain both life and the perception of the immateriality of the soul as emerging things. And eco-philosophies, even if they reject modern science to a certain way, they become postmodern sciences, and they try to explain everything within a materialistic and evolutionary paradigm. So they even dare to say that the perception of having an immaterial soul is something beneficial for us from an evolutionary point of view. I don't know what the evidence is for this, but to a great extent it is a pre-assumption that the only thing that exists is matter. If we take the initial philosophy, we understand that there is an essence which is not material. It is difficult for us nowadays to imagine, but we could say that everything has a soul. That is what Aristotle says, that a plant has a vegetable soul. Obviously, the man has a much deeper soul. The problem of emergence, as is used now in science, say that everything comes top to bottom. And that is a problem with evolution. Showing that everything comes from top to bottom, we have the problem of the sense of things.
So everything is lesser, and we go to determinism, and we go to fatalism, actually. And I believe that there in nature, we need to understand the constant relationship between the material and the non-material part. That was very intuitive for everyone for centuries. And it is just nowadays that we have problems with that. But I believe that understanding the emergence as not something coming out of matter, but the interrelationship between matter and non-material things, and material things, the essence of things, and how it allows for the emergence of new characteristics, working with the same base, which is matter. And this more scientific vision of emergence, well, maybe along the scientific line, I'd like to start by giving you an example of what we believe an emerging property is. When we say, for instance, that this is a hard material, we're talking about the emergent property because atoms, molecules that compose that material that don't have the roughness per se, the strength per se. So how does the strength per se of the material begins? It is a collective property when a sufficient number of atoms or molecules get together. For instance, the fact that humid water is liquid, and most of us will agree on that, it's not a complex statement, but a hydrogen or an oxygen atom, the molecule of water per se, it does not make sense to say that it is humid. How does that property start? It seems as if properties emerge or new things emerge in nature. But there's two basic visions of the emergence in contemporary science. One would be emergency understood as something epistemic. Emergence, after all, is something that we believe is novel, but it is just an appearance, an illusion, because it might be described perfectly well from the basic components and the fundamental interactions. A classical example is the rainbow, which is emergent epistemologically, maybe not because the rainbow is not there. It is just an optic illusion produced by light when it goes through water. But there seems to be other issues, so the natural properties which seem not to be clearly so much related to the epistemic emergence category, but ontologically they're really emergent.
That is to say, that even if I don't know all the properties of the particles that make it up, would give a reason of how it emerges, how it becomes. And here we have the question of whether we live in nature, where there is new causality, where, as Michael said, there is a relationship between the material and the immaterial, how this gives rise to new beings, new systems, new properties. It seems that one could not foresee evolution from scratch. Just imagine we have all the different correlations, and we could have foreseen that in a planet of the solar system 4,500 million years ago, the first bacteria appeared, and it was developed until it formed the biosphere as we know it today. Probably not, because there are different ways of causality, and science has to take this into consideration. And I have to say that this is a very relevant topic to understand, to take a step forward, since we're with expanded reason here, as to how this looking to nature, this awe towards nature, can make us understand more the transcendence of God, and more importantly, a personal God, because sometimes the problem of not believer scientists is that they say, okay, I accept there is a principle and that there's something else in the nature deep down, but what does it mean that God is personal? Something that I'm greatly convinced is when Joseph Ratzinger says that contemplating how nature works with this novelty, and at the same time with assuming what has happened in the past with this history, nature which is historical, which keeps developing, which is self-determined, which creates new levels. This is what you would expect of a personal God, of a God for whom relation is important and who gives great importance to freedom, to laws at each level of nature, to self-determination on each level. This is an argument that doesn't prove everything, but I believe it is convincing, because I believe it is a nature much more colorful and more deeper than nature where everything is predetermined, which is all calculated, like many people understand nature, like calculation of the universe. Well, it is like big computer. Well, this is the new metaphor nowadays to understand nature. Big computer. Well, we have gone from the model computer brain to the model computer nature. I don't know how we're doing on time. I think it's 20 past. And I would like to know if any of the attendees have a question. Well, in any way, I believe it is a good time to see if we have any questions from the public. I believe someone has raised his or her hand, and we would like. Do we have a microphone for them? Otherwise, we won't be able to translate. So I think they're asking out loud, but we cannot listen here up in the booth. Now we can. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for all your thoughts. From what Einstein said, that God doesn't play with dice, and Hawking says that God not only plays with dice, but he hides even the dice for us not to see them. What's the game here? I would say that the image of dice is very poor. This would be like my short answer. Einstein's vision is a rather mechanicistic logic, but well, maybe not mechanicistic, but he thought that our task was to describe a nature which was already determined. And Einstein's vision well presents physics have a problem explaining the present time, because we explain the present time as a time which is different from the past and from the future. But in Einstein's universe, it's wishful thinking, this difference between the past and the present. To what extent can we understand this? Well, I did not know. You said this is Stephen Hawking's statement that that God not only plays with dice, but he hides them. Well, I would tend to say that I agree more with Stephen Hawking than with Einstein. I would say, without going to the cosmologic question, that if God hides, he does so that the simple people, the children, those who are open to wonder, can discover. And I believe he hides, so he allows us to discover what we need for our material life and to preserve our freedom. And it is a great gift, because if we did not have freedom to love him, we wouldn't be able to love. And I believe there is a great meaning in this hiding on the part of God, but also allowing us to find him. Are there any other questions?
I would like to know whether something I took away from your discussion is correct. I gather that if you're talking about the quantum level of physics, I think you implied that Heisenberg said that that observation was necessary. Is that correct? That for us to know that a particle is there, somehow it implies the existence of an observer. Is that correct?
So you say the observation is necessary for what exactly?
The observation is necessary to measure and identify the presence of the particle.
To gather information.
At least some aspect of the particle.
Yeah. Observation is necessary to gather information about some magnitudes of the particle that are relevant to us. So, in other words, if you don't have observation, you cannot assume that those magnitudes are well defined. So they are indeterminate, but ontologically indeterminate.
All right, so they're indeterminate without there being an observer.
That's right.
Now, that observer is, I assume, a human observer, not a dog or a raven and this implies human consciousness. That is, I can't imagine that you could observe something without being conscious.
Not necessarily. So, as far as we know, human consciousness is sufficient for the collapse of the wave function, but we don't know for sure that it's necessary. So maybe there are other sort of observation of nature about itself that provokes this determination, this collapse of the wave function.
What I was trying to get at is it possible that consciousness, which is a necessary component of observation, is therefore like a fundamental particle, a basic constitutional object, that it is like physical things, an ultimate non-physical entity. Because we notice its necessary presence at this basic level.
There is a beautiful result by, I don't remember the name, sorry, but it's called the free will theorem, in which the authors show that if the experimenter has free will in determining the orientation of the axis, formation, the spin of some particles, then these particles have also some sort of free will to determine themselves. So there seems to be some sort of pre-free will or freedom in these particles. So what's the relevance of this? So of course, free will is much more than that.
It seems to me to imply the non-physical notion of human consciousness as an elementary thing in the universe, like particles, but not physical.
You are saying that consciousness is something like a new fundamental magnitude in the universe.
Yes. Yes.
I wouldn't say
speculating with that. I'm not saying it.
Yeah, one of the theories of the minds in philosophy of mind, one of the theories that you may have now is called panpsychism, that basically, as far as I know, says that every bit of matter, every bit of existence does have some sort of consciousness. Just think about an electron. So it has the consciousness of being with spin up or spin down. So of course there is a scaling of consciousness in the universe. So this panpsychism has the problem of how to explain how to combine all this proto-consciousness or consciousness to provide this huge, this magnificent consciousness that we enjoy as human beings. In my opinion, I don't think that's necessary, because I don't think that consciousness is stuff. So I think that consciousness is related to form as a co-principle. So in that sense, I wouldn't call consciousness a fundamental stuff in nature. So it's a principle or a co-principle, but I wouldn't call it stuff or substance.
No, I didn't mean to imply it had a physical existence, but that there was a non-physical foundational notion of consciousness as existing. But enough.
Let me interrupt just a little bit. If you say that the magnitude has a value when it's observed, that conscious is enough to collapse the waveform of a particle, what happens if there's no conscious at all?
What happened if?
There's no conscious. There's no conscious being.
Well, I don't know whether this discussion would make sense if there is no consciousness in the universe. Not even science. I mean.
Okay.
So I guess you're asking, so what happened before the human being appeared in the universe?
That's right.
So that's why I said that consciousness is sufficient, but probably it's not necessary. So there are other sources of determination in nature.
Buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias por esta mesa redonda.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this very interesting roundtable. I have a question. You showed your admiration for Isaac Newton, and I share it. I was thinking that Isaac Newton, when he found these laws in nature, he saw clearly that it was a proof of the existence of God, and that it was required to found a new theology on the discoveries, in the same way that Galileo said that it was the world that was written by God in mathematic characters. In this vision, this necessary fund of laws that were stated as nature by these authors, there was an argument about an intelligent creator, and it was a powerful argument. But I was wondering, in the contemporaneous world, we're talking, deepening in the studies about the second law of thermodynamics, that the world is not so much in balance as we used to say. Rather, it's the world that is looking for balance in the maximum entropy, and as it goes toward that maximum entropy, each one of the states generates bifurcations, modifications. It generates the change that will make the state to change once more again, in such a way that it does not seem that we may foresee what is going to happen in the future, that it does not seem that the world is so determined, and rather it appears with much more force the statistic mechanics as a way through the probability of explaining the world. Allow me for the introduction, but what I wanted to know is, what is it that theology thinks about this situation? What are the theological reflections that have appeared from that idea that seems to challenge, or maybe not, the idea of this intelligent creator that has determined nature in this way, as Newton and other authors used to think? Well, I believe it would be pretentious from my side to talk about what it has generated in theology. I don't know so much on that, although I have worked slightly on this. But I believe that there are theological currents that try to introduce somehow these visions, new visions. For instance, the so-called open theism that tries to prove how God would act in evolution, or for instance, there's a theological project called NIODA, non-interventionist objective divine action, trying to understand how divine action of God in nature is without it being an interventionist action, that is to say that we don't have an improvising God. It is the problem of God that intervenes. If it is the same God that has created the laws of nature, it is a God then that is correcting all the time himself, and that's nonsense for a scientist. So we need to improve the description, right? I believe that to a greater scale, it should generate a theology of creation, a theology of nature, maybe even theology of creation, because I believe that, well, talking about nature only for theology, it runs the risk of us forgetting about the fundamental relationship that exists between nature and its creator. On the other hand, a creation theology would allow also to underline the fact that creation is, from the beginning, a creation in Christ, is a creation that is done with a view to incarnation, to communion, to that aim or end of the universe that we don't know, but that faith says that it is the divinization of the universe until God is God in all, as Corinthians 1:15-28 says, I believe. Anyway, these reflections, I believe, are necessary, but we need to be very cautious when we do them, because there's many things that scientifically are controversial yet. We have just held an controversial exchange. We need to send them also through the screening of the criticism and then theology, which is cautious, but there's very promising material. That's all, as much as I can say. I will maybe add only that God, the God of Isaac Newton and the God of Galileo, in the quotes that you're given, even Galileo was a Catholic, is more prone to the vision of a deist God, the watchman, the big architect of the world. It is an idea of God which is modern, dangerous, and not very Catholic, that gives rise to the idea that God maybe created the world, but then he left, and that we filled in. The vision I propose in my book, I believe, is coincident with the Catholic view from the beginning, that it is a God that is extremely intimate with the world, extremely transcendent, but also more intimate than myself. Because if I am not the source of my own existence, it has to be God, right? And therefore, in this view, in this vision, God is present in everything and in everyone, but in a way which is mysterious, hidden, that allows for the freedom, that allows for at least the appearance that the laws may be developed in a way that God has designed. It is very important to take one step go one step back and correct those mistakes, theological errors. That might help us understand our philosophy and our science within the context which is more adequate, I believe. It's 22. I don't know if we have questions. Time for one more question. Anybody? Well, in any case, please be very brief, because we need to finish at 1:45 so that we don't run late. I'm going to try to be brief and concise. Thank you very much for your contributions. It's very inspiring for philosophy. Maybe some of us don't know much about science, but it's necessary to have that knowledge. My question is about evolutionism and Darwin's theory. In what sense do you believe that it has been overcome? Do you know? The Everson theory, does it refute itself? And do you believe that we can talk about spiritual evolution to a certain way, to a certain meaning? Sometimes we may say that there's not an evolution, but rather a movement backwards, but it is true that there's some inexplicable qualitative changes, irreducible mechanicistic explanation, at least would say so. So to sum up, what is the relationship that throughout the evolution there is between matter and spirit? And if there is an spiritual relationship, if that is the case, if there is an end point or not, does it have to do with a good designation or not? If I understood you the question, I think it could really take a lot of time to answer you, but if I'm not taking too much time, I would just need to tell you that if all the things have a matter and a shape in a non-material science, there should be an immaterial accompaniment, right? And this would have a qualitative leap when it gets to the human being, right? And the theology of St. Thomas has a concept for that, which is called the reductio, when the soul of the man becomes self-conscious and therefore it may relate to God already. That might allow for an evolution geared or directed by the immaterial that takes a material gradual change of man and a qualitative leap to the spiritual level. That would be to come into a relationship with God, but God would accompany all of that process. It would she would be present, but we may discuss afterwards if you don't mind, because this is a very wide topic that might be misunderstood, but there is room for that, I believe. To contribute with something, I'd like to say that I do not believe that it is honest to talk about errors, Darwin's mistakes. Darwin requires a new explanation framework, the evolutive framework, the rational framework commonly accepted by all. Maybe he didn't know the question of the information of genes, or maybe he didn't know that evolution has leaps which are not so gradual as he thought, or maybe the evolution itself needs clarifications, such as what is the level that we're talking about, because it's the level of individuals, the level of genes. Well, amongst biologists and evolutionists, there's discussions, but always within the Darwinian framework. We could talk about a new Darwinism or a synthetic theory of evolution, but I don't think it is fair to talk about Darwin mistakes in a separation and the way that the basic mechanics. I don't know so much the person vital theory. Vitalism is not well considered. I think we may talk about a spiritual evolution, to not give you more details because I don't feel safe talking about that, but I nevertheless would like to refer to some terms by Ratzinger, Introduction of Christianism, in his explanation framework to the evolution. He says the interesting thing about this is that the final step of evolution is evolution of a spirit that counts with freedom. It's not just the evolution carried out by random mutation of genes, of natural selection, but rather this human freedom that we evolve with. So the evolution with society, the evolution that we know in human societies. When you're talking about the spiritual evolution, maybe you're referring more to the soul of each person, right? But we can discuss that privately later. I shouldn't talk because I'm just the chairperson. I'm not a guest speaker, but I think that we need to be careful when we talk about theory and not confuse it with hypothesis, because a theory is something that is sufficiently clear, maybe not written in a stone, but it is not a theory. Depending on the hypothesis, it's risky. So in this case, I certainly support Darwinist theory. So people who are living for science maybe can explain this much better, but we need to differentiate between hypothesis and theory. I'm sorry, I couldn't avoid talking. Anyway, Michael, thank you so much. Javier, thank you very much for this 1 hour and 45 minutes that we've been talking about. I hope that the audience has been as happy as we, I believe, have been, and I would like to thank the organizers, obviously, and to Expanded Reason for allowing for these very wealthy dialogues, very interesting dialogues, very enriching dialogues. Thank you.